Bantu expansion. This was a huge wave of movement by early Bantu-speaking peoples, starting from a region in West Central Africa. Over time, these groups spread out, mixing with or displacing the existing communities they encountered, like the hunter-gatherers and pastoralists who lived there before them. One of the coolest things about this migration is that we can trace it through language. Many of the languages spoken across Sub-Saharan Africa today have clear similarities, showing a shared cultural root. The core of the Bantu languages, which belong to the larger Atlantic Congo family, actually originated in the southern part of what's now Cameroon. But it wasn't just language that spread. Genetic evidence also points to a massive migration from Central Africa, where Bantu peoples mixed with local groups as they moved. Now, this expansion didn't happen overnight. It took place over two main waves, starting about 4,000 years ago. The first wave went along the northern edge of the Congo forest, moving toward East Africa. The second wave went south, following Africa's Atlantic coast and heading inland along rivers. Eventually, Bantu-speaking peoples reached all the way to South Africa by around 300 AD. So, why did this expansion happen in the first place? Well, experts think it was likely due to advancements like farming, making ceramics, and the use of iron. These innovations helped the Bantu-speaking peoples move into new regions and thrive. They either assimilated or pushed out earlier populations, like the hunter-gatherer Khoisan people who had lived in southern Africa. And when Bantu speakers arrived in eastern and southern Africa, they encountered other groups like Cushitic and Nilotic peoples, from whom they may have adopted livestock farming. By the time Bantu-speaking communities moved south, herding practices had already spread there, long before their arrival. This massive migration reshaped the genetic makeup of the continent, creating a complex blend of Bantu speakers and the local groups they encountered. Even recent studies, like a 2023 genetic survey, show how the Bantu expansion began around 4,000 years ago, with Bantu peoples mixing with local populations as they spread across Africa. And now let's talk about the languages tied to the Bantu expansion. These Bantu languages are actually part of a much larger group called the Atlantic Congo language family, which stretches across western, central, and southern Africa. Specifically, the Benue Congo branch includes all the Bantu languages that spread throughout Central, Southern, and Eastern Africa. Now, what's interesting about many of these languages is their use of tone. Almost all of them, except for a few like Swahili, Sotho-Tswana, and the Nguni languages, use tone to change the meaning of words. Another cool feature is that they don't really use case inflections like in some other language families, but instead, they rely heavily on grammatical gender, sometimes having up to 24 different noun classes. When it comes to verbs, the root usually stays the same, and things like tense and mood are expressed using extra words or auxiliary verbs. Before the Bantu speakers started expanding, Central, Southern, and Southeast Africa were home to a mix of different peoples. There were Pygmy foragers, Khoisan-speaking hunter-gatherers, Nilo-Saharan herders, and Cushitic-speaking pastoralists who lived in these areas. In Central Africa, the Bantu people are thought to have shared a common ancestry with Pygmy groups about 70,000 years ago. Some Pygmy groups today speak Bantu languages, but they still have a lot of unique words, especially those related to forest life like honey collection. This shows how they retained some of their own language while mixing with the Bantu. When it comes to southern Africa, before the Bantu arrived, it was mainly inhabited by Khoisan-speaking peoples. Over time though, most of them mixed with other groups and adopted different languages. Some still live by foraging in places like the Kalahari Desert, but many have shifted to working for neighboring farmers, while others, like the Nama people, continue herding livestock. In Southeast Africa, there were also Cushitic-speaking groups who migrated down from the Ethiopian highlands. They settled around Lake Turkana and parts of Tanzania, starting about 5,000 years ago. Much later, around the year 1000 AD, some eastern Cushitic-speaking people also settled along the Kenyan coast. At the same time, Khoisan-speaking groups were also present in the area, along with Nilo-Saharan-speaking herders. As the Bantu expansion continued, the movement wasn't always a straightforward replacement of earlier populations. In some places, like Mozambique and among the African Pygmies, the Bantu language was adopted through a process of language shift and intermixing, not complete population replacement. In other areas, however, like in parts of Central Africa, genetic evidence suggests a much larger population replacement as Bantu speakers moved in. By around 500 BC, Bantu-speaking communities had reached the heart of Central Africa's rainforest and even further south into the savannas of present-day Angola and Zambia. Meanwhile, another group of Bantu speakers had moved eastward and settled around the Great Lakes of East Africa, where they found rich environments that could support larger populations. In fact, the Yoruba culture, which dominated the region between 650 BC and 550 BC, was one of Africa's earliest iron-smelting cultures. These early Bantu communities were also among the first to develop iron forging techniques in the Great Lakes region, which allowed them to produce carbon steel as early as the 1st century BC. Their migration towards Southeast Africa accelerated, with small groups moving quickly, setting up communities near rivers and the coast. By 300 AD, Bantu-speaking groups had reached what is now South Africa's KwaZulu-Natal region. Between the 11th and 17th centuries, powerful Bantu-speaking kingdoms started to emerge. These included the Kingdom of Congo, the Bunyoro-Katara Kingdom, the Kingdom of Mapungubwe, and the Monomatapa Kingdom, known for building Great Zimbabwe. The Swahili city-states also flourished during this time, with coastal trading hubs like Lamu, Mombasa, and Kilwa thriving through connections with Arabian and Indian traders. This growth in state formation wasn't just because of larger populations. It was also driven by new technological innovations, increased trade, and more sophisticated political structures. From there, these Bantu-speaking kingdoms would continue to shape the history of Africa well into the modern era.